society organizations, retailers, importers, U.S. industry, anyone who has an interest in law. We talked about self-initiation and the fact that both the commissioner and the deputy commissioner the law seriously. And I think with that, I will say that Section 910 of the TIFTIA also requires us to submit an annual report to Congress, and that's just another vehicle for us to provide additional transparency and for folks to get some level of comfort that we're actually taking the statute seriously at CBP. And so we heard Congress loud and clear. And we will continue to abide by the law, and we do want to make the provision have teeth, but we also understand the interests of importers, and we want to make sure that it's a fair process on both sides of the fence. So that, I will turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Eric. Speak about your reaction to the change and what you'd like to see addressed with regard to implementation and any other remarks.
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to thank the ABA, you guys for putting this together. I think there's a lot of interest in closure to this loophole, just reflected by all the emails I've gotten over the last 6 months from law firms and companies and other NGOs asking, what for some information on our experience actually using the Tariff Act complaint process. And I also wanted to start with just adding a little global context to the closure of the consumptive demand loophole and the Tariff Act. If we step back and look at what's happening around the issue of forced labor and modern day slavery and human trafficking, we can see that the closure of the consumptive demand loophole is part of a broader trend. 2010, California passed the California Supply Chain Transparency Act, requiring companies to report on whatever steps they're taking to address forced labor and human trafficking in their supply chains. A few years later, at the UN guiding principles were adopted and endorsed widely by states, companies, and NGOs. Those principles, while they're not binding, are very strong in recommending that companies do robust due diligence to eliminate any impact that their supply chains could be having on human rights broadly, including forced labor and human trafficking. And then after that, 2015, the UK Modern Slavery Act is passed. And so there's a clear line here going from, this is wrong, we ought to do something, to actually requiring companies to do something. And seen in this context, I think the United States, and we can feel pretty good about closing the loophole. We've moved the ball even further now. Instead of just recommending that companies do their due diligence and eliminate human rights abuses from their supply chain, we're saying, wow, we can actually disrupt your supply chain. That there's actually regulatory consequences. So that's a big moment. And I think it's just, it's great, it's exciting, but that's why we're here. So with that said, I want to just talk about, a little background. ILRF, the International Labor Rights Forum, is a 30-year-old NGO based here in Washington, D.C. We got our start by trying to get labor conditions placed into trade agreements, basically having basic labor standards in trade agreements, and that that happened in the 80s through the Generalized System of Preferences, the GSP program, and we've continued that advocacy through today. And today we do basically research and campaigning and advocacy around forced labor, child labor, the right to organize, basic labor rights in global supply chains. So that's kind of where we're coming from. We have used the Tariff Act 4 times in the last, 18 years. And we've, I'll just tick off the cases that we've brought from petitions. We filed a petition against hand-knotted carpets from India and Pakistan. We filed a petition against cocoa from 2 West African countries, I believe Cote Gottwald and Ghana. And then more recently, petitions related to cotton produced with forced labor from Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Looking at the process, the Tariff Act process, I have a couple reflections and ideas for our friends at CBP about how the process might be improved. I guess one reflection is that when you file a Tariff Act petition, it sort of goes into a regulatory black box. You submit it, and then you don't necessarily get any feedback on, was it a strong petition? When they reviewed it, did they think that we missed a few steps, or their investigation ran out at a certain point? They couldn't link the forced labor to a particular shipment. So I think improving communication between CBP and petitioners is going to be a key element to making the Tariff Act more effective and more user-friendly, I'd put it. And also, the idea of like the black box again is that you submit a petition, Customs does some sort of investigation, but there are no deadlines. And so a petition can sort of be out there in limbo for years. It'll just be open. And you don't necessarily get updates or feedback from where are they at in the process. Is there an investigation ongoing? Have they effectively closed it? Has it been shelved? More information there would, I think, be useful not just to petitioners, but to companies, the trade, and the public who are trying to sort of monitor, how this is being enforced. I'll use one example. The petition that we filed on forced labor cotton from Uzbekistan. We filed a petition in 2013. We thought it was quite a strong case because the unique nature of the cotton production in Uzbekistan, it's sort of a holdover from Soviet times. It's a state-run cotton sector, and so all the cotton produced there is sold to effectively the Uzbek government, and the government, as it's been well documented, forces citizens to harvest the cotton. Doctors, teachers, everybody during the harvest season, you must go out, or you lose your job, you'll be put in jail. So it's clear forced labor on a mass scale. Every piece of cotton that comes from Uzbekistan is harvested through this system. So there's no question of, is this particular shipment containing Uzbek cotton have forced labor? We know it does. So we thought it was a strong case for enforcement, but we didn't. Again, a sort of year went by, we didn't really hear anything, and what we ended up having to do to try to gain some clarity on CBP's enforcement efforts was we filed a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, and which is far from ideal, but we did get a response, but they claimed that an investigation was ongoing, and there's an exception under FOIA for ongoing law enforcement investigations. So we didn't learn any information from the FOIA request. We did, however, and I think this highlights a little bit of the transparency issue here. We actually learned that CBP did stop a shipment of goods with products containing Uzbek cotton. They stopped a shipment at port. We learned that, though, through a third party, because a company was complaining in Uzbekistan, saying, "Oh my God, our importer in the U.S. is complaining they couldn't receive the shipment." This is how we learned about it, and we couldn't get any confirmation from CBP. So again, I think there's, that's sort of where we're at now, and I think as they revisit the regulations, it's really important that we create a process that we're all communicating a little more clearly. I'll say just maybe so that those are my thoughts on the process. On the enforcement approach, I think one challenge that we can all keep our eye on in order to gauge has the closure of the deceptive demand loophole resulted in a new era of robust enforcement is, if you look at the enforcement history of the Tariff Act, most of the enforcement petitions relate to forced labor in Chinese prisons, basically prison camps where folks are made, to make things, and that's great, and that is absolutely forced labor. It's covered under the Tariff Act. But if you look at the wider world and global economy and where forced labor is happening, the ILO, the International Labor Organization, estimates that 90% of forced labor is in the private sector. It's not in prisons, it's not in state-controlled factories. It's at the bottom of the supply chains. It's at second, third, fourth tier down of supply chains. And I think CBP's got to find a way to get issue WROs with release orders that address forced labor as it's happening now in the global economy. So I think things to look for WROs coming out that are not China prison labor, but are seafood in Thailand that's happening on these modern day slavery that's literally happening on these fishing boats. In a company supply chain, Red Lobster supply chain, whoever, just to name somebody, not saying, but that's a game changer. An enforcement order like that is absolutely a game changer. That's what we're looking for, and we're excited to see how this unfolds, and we're very heartened by CBP's outreach. It's been really good in terms of engaging NGOs and companies on how they might pursue reform of the Tariff Act. Commissioner Kolakowski's comments, are very heartening, and we're just going to keep monitoring this as it goes forward.
Well, firstly, thank you very much to the ABA for being here. I'm sorry I actually created slides. I actually created 2 slides, so I'm sorry about that. But
Sorry for being with
I think it'll be a little bit useful. First thing, I'm going to talk a little bit about the broader context. I think certainly the Tariff Act and some of the other measures you mentioned are really, really important. I'll come back to that a little bit. But coming from an industry perspective, the electronic industry principally, I want to talk a little bit about what we have been doing, not just on forced labor, but broadly, and then zero down to forced labor. Just kind of right off the bat, certainly from the members that are part of the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition, we don't want forced labor in any aspect of our supply chain. Certainly that's something that the companies that gathered together to form, or have gathered together to form this grouping, believe in not just in forced labor, but child labor and a number of other measures. But there certainly is some complexities across global supply chains, and certainly when you're operating in certain countries where the rule of law or some customary business practices are used to being done in a certain way, there certainly is a number of complexities that companies need to have the right kind of tools and the right kind of programs that can, one, detect and to remediate those kinds of issues working with government and civil society. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what is the ICC, because I always like to say we're a very well-kept secret in this town, and then maybe kind of zero down on forced labor. So this is the ICC as last I checked, because it kind of changes all the time. So we were created in 2004, basically as some of the big brands that you all know in the electronic industry began to realize that, wow, we have some issues as we have these global supply chains that are producing in all parts of the world. We certainly have some issues on human rights that need to be addressed. So they came together and they figured out that it was probably a little bit better if they worked together to address these issues rather than each of them having to do it separately. And if you look at some of the manufacturing for electronics products, for an iPhone, a computer, you name it, a lot of these lines are, a lot of like Intel, Apple, or whomever really, I'm just using an example, have, the same component manufacturers making the same lines in different factories. So the thinking behind it was, let's come together under this umbrella and kind of push suppliers to improve their working conditions across the board. Since then, we've grown exponentially, so we started with about 20. In 2013, we had about 60. We're at 110-ish or something like that. And the kind of interesting trend, and I would say this is one of these from this year, is that we're no longer just electronics. And Ford joined us, Hasbro joined us about 2 weeks ago. partially because some of the things that we're talking about here, a growing trend in interest in joining and a growing use of electronics in other products. Basically, I'm sorry that this doesn't come out perfectly, and I'm sorry if this is too small, but the whole work or the whole organization is built around a code of conduct, which is a management system approach that takes in those actually five pillars. So basically, labor ethics, environment, health, and safety, with a management system approach that you would put into your factory. So this code of conduct, all our members have to agree to that, and then have to push it down to their supply chain. The code of conduct is not a static document, and I'll talk a little bit more about this related to forced labor later, but it goes under periodic revision. So we're about to enter our I think we're in code 5.1, but we're about to enter our code revision process, and this is not just the companies that input into this. So we take input from civil society, from government, anyone can input into this and can strengthen the code. With the code, and I actually got rid of this slide because I didn't want to have too many slides, but there's a pretty robust audit program. So we have what we call a party audit program. So we have 9 audit firms, independent audit firms that audit. You have to do a self-assessment questionnaire of your factories, and then we have an audit program that audits those factories, depending on high risk, audits those factories. And we have a 4th party auditor that audits the others. So there's a fairly complicated system that is in there that is sort of independent from us here in the U.S. that looks into these processes. And all these audits, all this work is shared under a massive database. So in other words, the supplier and auditee owns the audit that can then be shared with different companies. So there's an opportunity to apply leverage and pressure in order to improve conditions when things are coming in the supply chain. And we also have a training academy to do that. So taking a step back, you went for labor. I mean, you guys have already sort of articulated this slide for me. I mean, obviously, forced labor is a global problem affecting all industries across the supply chains. So we know there's government regulation, there's civil society monitoring, customer demands, and investor requirements to deal with this issue. It is a complicated issue, and just for the electronic industry, I mean, we've been banning forced labor in our code of conduct pretty much since the inception of EICC. But we noticed in 2014 there was a State Department report that Verite, which is one of our audit firms as well, put together, which did find that in Malaysia there was about 30 to 35 or maybe 40% of incidents of forced labor. Again, this is where I go back to the challenge of this particular issue, because a lot of the time, especially in Asia, when just the working patterns is to bring in migrant workers from certain parts of Asia, lower or poorer parts of Asia to other countries, and then take their passports or charge them fees. In fact, in Malaysia, which is a big hub for the electronic industry, there's a government mandated levy on foreign workers, which is a big problem. In fact, the TPP is trying to address that to get rid of that, but right now, given the status of TPP, it could be a little bit complicated, but it's certainly something that creates a real difficulty where the government is actually asking companies to charge a levy and oftentimes to the workers. So really our role in addressing forced labor is obviously to identify trends and convene not just our companies but also the other industries. And I think the really important part for what we do is a solution provider. So we're not an advocate, so we're not advocating for the Tariff Act, against the Tariff Act, or for the UK Modern Slavery Act. We're providing a set of tools and solutions. So we're going to help our companies give them a due diligence program to comply with the UK Modern Slavery, to comply with the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation here in the U.S., which bans forced labor in the supply chain, to the California Supply Chain Act. There's talk about it in the law right now in the French National Assembly Nationale that's about to go through. And there are a number of others that are out there. So we're providing tools and a framework that can help in that regard. And really kind of the vision that we're articulating now, and which is literally evolving as we speak, is the ideal to create an end-to-end framework for responsible labor practices. So we want to hit the whole journey of the worker. So we want to get them from the time where he goes from his home country. So we're offering and we're developing pre-departure orientation, labor agent certification. A lot of the times, forced labor or workers find themselves in forced labor situations, because of the agent, a broker who brings the worker from a village or from a country to the factory or to another point. So we're trying to develop, we're working with folks to to develop a certification process that can help, I would say, detect or at least separate the good from the bad from people. So again, pre-departure orientation is also another important tool to help inform workers of their rights. A lot of times people find themselves in a forced labor situation because things are put in another language that they don't speak, or they don't have access to their contracts, their work contracts, is not even the language. So again, that's something else that we're doing. Again, following that with an ethical recruitment process that they're in for both the laborers and the school, and then we're developing a grievance mechanism, which we're piloting in the labor, which would be all those little stars that you see there, which would develop a full program that would allow for worker representative programs, a helpline, an assistant desk, and training, so folks can know. It's called a workplace of choice program, but folks can know that when they find themselves in a situation, where do they turn to? Obviously, in some countries, this would be the job that is an important job of the labor union, which obviously we work with pretty closely, but in some countries or some factories where that's not as robust, we certainly want to be able to offer an opportunity to be able to do that. So we're building a program there. And actually, that's not on this slide. We're aiming toward, and this is probably a 2020, post-2020 situation, is a factory certification program. In other words, we want to certify a factory as a clean factory. In other words, if you pass a series of tests, a series of programs, a series of audits, that factory can then get a credential or a certificate if we're still working on this that would say, look, we're clean of forced labor for a period of time. Obviously, that's a much more complicated process. So we're in the process of building that membership as we speak, but this is another piece of the puzzle. And finally, this is where I go back a little bit to how we address forced labor. I mentioned some of these programs, but really it all stems from our code of conduct. So as I mentioned, the Verite report found that there were instances of forced labor in the electronic supply chain. So we actually, in this code revision process, I believe this was 2014 into 2015, we actually made a number of revisions where we ensured that workers should not be required to pay any kind of recruitment fee, as well as defining fees. May not hold passports, shall be free to leave their time or terminate their employment, must have an employment agreement in their native language, and no unreasonable restriction on workers' freedom of movement. I think that's really, we were probably the first industry group, or maybe even one of the few industry groups that has gone this far to actually ban recruitment fees. Again, this is the standard way to do business in some of these countries where we have a lot of sources. So that's been a pretty big deal. It came into effect this year when our code, our Region 5.1. Again, we're now going to be looking at strengthening this code of conduct over a 2-year process, starting in January, I believe. And again, building all these tools, including a supplemental BMP, supplemental forced labor audits, and some of these other things that I've mentioned, so that this is a very complicated issue. Companies can actually have a toolbox that can come in and we kind of detect it and then remediate it. And finally, in terms of really what kind of a global picture, what we would say is, obviously, forced labor is not an issue that an industry by itself can address. Clearly here we have a panel that has government representatives, that has civil society. I think the investor voice is very important. I think we need to continue to work in partnership by using some legal means, such as the Tariff Act, disclosure mechanisms, such as the FAR, the UK Modern Slavery Act. But certainly these are all things that need to be done together. Again, need to involve all sectors. As I mentioned, one of the things we found sometimes is that when we strengthen our code in electronics, some workers would just go work more hours overtime in other industries because just the way the seasonal, the way business is done in some parts of the world, they want to work certain number of hours and go back to their village. So I think it's important to kind of get as many industries as possible on the table so that they can talk about the different challenges and kind of build in some best practices and share them, build some processes. And again, focus on some of these things that have already been done, not just on the process. I mentioned the conflict resourcing initiative. We house that as well. It's a good example. The CFSI, for those that don't know, is sort of the downstream industry solution to Dodd-Frank, the reporting requirement for Section 15.2 of Dodd-Frank in terms of the minerals that are coming from conflict-affected areas in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We've built a pretty robust audit program of smelters. In other words, we can develop we have a due diligence program that can tell if a certain mineral came from a conflict-affected mine in the DRC. That doesn't cover forced labor, that doesn't cover child labor. It's looking at that, which is what Dodd-Frank is a reporting requirement of. But now we have over 300 companies beyond electronics that are actually using this program and have been able to. You'll never say you can make every supply chain clean, but have been able to deal with, especially the teeth, and tungsten, have been able to at least least identify and offer materiality into those supply chains very deeply. We're actually just also now working on a responsible raw material